Hi everyone. We've got to finish promptly at 5, which means we're going to start promptly now. We decided that Laurie wasn't going to do an address, but we're going to do a sort of in conversation with him about the state in the world. I mean, you all know who he is. Sir Lawrence Freedman is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College, co-author of the Comment is Freed Substack, which you don't know you should go and find out about because it's fantastic. And he is an expert on all things international and particularly military. And I thought it'd be nice to end the day with some reflections on the broader world we live in. And the first question, Laurie, firstly, thank you. The first question about the broader world, I suppose, is it really as dangerous as everyone keeps telling me it is? Because it's very easy nowadays, listening to any politician or any analyst, to think, oh my God, this is a nightmare.
Yes, I mean, I was struck by Rob's comment in the last session. Everybody... Is that better? Okay. I was struck by Rob's comment in the last session. Everybody thinks it was better in the past. When you reach a certain age, as I have now reached, you can remember all sorts of periods when people thought the world was going to an end. I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, or that awful period in the early 70s, not only in this country, but when you had the Arab-Israeli war, followed by the OPEC price rises. The Soviet Union seemed to be on the up, everybody else on the down, Watergate, etc. I mean, there's always good room for gloom. And we've been living in the presence of nuclear weapons, which is what makes people really gloomy and doomy, since 1945. So, and there have been times when we've been apparently closer to nuclear war than we are now. So there's always difficulty when you get these questions of finding the right balance between complacency and panic. I think there are reasons to be worried because we've got a major war in Europe, which we haven't seen anything like that since 1945. We've got, I think, a built-in instability in the Middle East now that's going to be very hard to get rid of. And we've got this basic question of what's China up to, which is a difficult one to answer. I think in some ways the most difficult of all these sets of questions. So there's plenty to worry about and watch. I don't think we're on an inevitable path to world war or anything like that, but it needs a lot of attention. And you know, when you think about a new government coming in, a few days after the election is announced, as the speaker starts swearing in, Starmer will be off to Washington for his first NATO summit, which is going to be very difficult with some big issues on the table. So, you know, it's something that we need to watch and be worried about. Just final point, the basic problem we have at the moment is we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to work out what's going on in the heads of dictators. You know, what is Putin? What Putin really is risk threshold? What's he really thinking? Is he a stealth man? Will he get what he wants through stealth, or is he going to make a really big push? What happens after the Ayatollah Khamenei? What's he thinking? So, I mean, I think this is one of the problems, that we've got opponents who aren't very transparent, and that makes it harder to work out exactly where we're going.
I mean, park that thought, because I'm going to come back and ask you what these people are thinking in a minute. We'll talk about each of these issues in a little bit more detail. But I mean, to what extent is our sense of insecurity in the West prompted by the fact that the West simply doesn't matter anymore? We're no longer the centre of world politics, and that's going to prompt a degree of unease, however benign the circumstances.
Well, I think we are the centre, I mean, not the centre of world politics. It's more multipolar than it was. In terms of GDP, there's no doubt that the West is stronger. The Russians talk about and others talk about the global majority now, but the global majority is not of one mind. I mean, I'm continually surprised by how difficult people find to think of India as an important player in the modern world, which doesn't think the same as Russia or China about a lot of its interests, doesn't think the same way as us either. So there are a lot of different power centers in the world, and that's an important feature, but the West is still by far the most cohesive bloc. Nobody has alliances like the United States does. Now that could fall apart, and that's a worry. And I think that, a lot of the current unease is looking forward to November and what happens after the next presidential election. We may have a better sense after the imminent debate between Trump and Biden. Spry young men upon whom the future of the world depends. So we may have a better sense after that. But Russia is a declining power with nuclear weapons. China is not rising as fast as everybody expected. So I think we should have more confidence, I think, in the West and its institutions and its democracy, with all the flaws we know that democracy has, and accepting that we're potentially going through a difficult time, both because of what happened what's going on in France at the moment, and potentially what will happen in the United States. But it's never a simple picture. But I don't think it's the case that the West is just sort of beside the point now.
Okay. So if we can turn to Ukraine, I suppose two questions about Ukraine. I mean, first is your sense of how the war is developing and how it will develop. But secondly, we hear a lot that phrase, Ukrainian security is our security. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, I think I can't imagine a bigger failure for the Western world were Ukraine forced to accept terms set by Putin. I think it would be catastrophic for Western self-confidence and security if this happened, even though it doesn't mean that the Russians are going to charge into Estonia or whatever the day after, because they've battered themselves in the process. But I think our security is bound up with Ukraine. Now, having said that, the war's in a strange and difficult stage. So a few months ago, it was hard not to be pretty gloomy about the way things were going. Ukraine had big problems with mobilization, big problems with its suppliers, particularly the United States. Europe was too slow, but trying harder. Slowly, those problems are being eased. But I think point one at the moment is that Russia has not taken advantage, as I expected them to and others did, with its advantages that it's enjoyed over the past few months. The Kharkiv offensive, which Putin gave quite a modest objective to, but he did give it an objective, hasn't achieved that objective. Now, every report you get from fighting in Ukraine uses words like tense and difficult and so on. So the pendulum hasn't swung. But there are other things going on. The economic sanctions introduced last week, which people didn't notice very much, caused real turbulence in the Russian economy. The Russian economy has coped better than everybody expected, so you don't assume this brings Russia to its knees, but it's adding to the strain. What Ukraine is doing in Crimea is making Crimea a very difficult proposition for Russia. On the other hand, Ukraine's infrastructure has been battered to pieces, and it's facing an incredibly difficult winter. So there's no point in talking about this as one side winning or indeed losing. Neither side is winning at the moment, and there's no good negotiating option available, as we saw from Putin's demands the other day. So the challenge that we've got is to keep Ukraine going and hopefully improving its position over quite a period, we just don't know how long, until such a point as Russia, I think, appreciates that the futility of what it's doing. And if you ask me how long this will take or how it'll happen, I don't know. But that's where we are, and this can happen in wars. There's a line that people use all the time: all wars end in negotiation, and they really don't. Lots of wars don't end with a negotiation. They end with capitulation, or they end with an uneasy ceasefire, or they peter out. A lot of negotiations don't end wars. So we have to be very realistic, I think, about a difficult situation which may last for some time. But there are physical limits on how long Russia, I think, can sustain this. And Ukraine is in a difficulty, but it's not beyond the Western world to keep Ukraine supplied. And it, you know, as people often comment, we're not the ones who are dying.
I mean, on that point, could and should the West have done more quickly?
Yes.
Is this partly our failure?
Well, yeah. I mean, but it's democratic politics. It's difficult to mobilize opinion, to accept the logic of positions. And there's an odd sort of thing that's happened in this war, is that we're ending up with positions that would have been almost unthinkable in February 2022, and we've got there incrementally. And one of the problems I think Russia has had, and one of the reasons why you find a lot of Russian commentary wondering about why its threats aren't taken as seriously as they would like them to be taken, is because it's you know, salami slicing. It's a little bit of you end up with the West supplying weapons that they had no intention of supplying right at the start, which can now hit into Russia. And at no stage has it ever seemed sensible or easy for Russia to find a way of escalating in response to that. So I think the real problems are not just us being too slow. I think that there's real problems with us having defense industries geared to a different sort of war, and getting production back again, which is a pan-European problem. It's surprising how long it takes. And one of the problems is, you know, what Ukraine needs by way of ammunition is for old stuff. You know, it's quite hard to get factories to start manufacturing ammunition for systems that are 10, 20, 30, 40 years old, even older in some cases.
I want to turn in a minute to what all this means for British foreign policy. But you said something when we were talking about global instability, I think, about systemic instability in the Middle East. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, obviously, we're focused on Gaza, which undoubtedly will be still high on anybody's agenda when they come in. But beyond Gaza, there is Iran. You've got Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis. Nobody's defeating them. I mean, you know, we just have to keep this in mind. Hamas has not been defeated, despite all that Israel has tried to do. Hamas doesn't, the military wing anyway, doesn't feel under any obligation to agree a ceasefire that doesn't involve an Israeli withdrawal. And this is recognized amongst a lot of Israeli commentators. The Houthis have not been defeated. They're still firing shots at warships. Hezbollah is still firing into southern Israel, into northern Israel, and which is still evacuated. And again, there's real worries about what would happen if Israel tried to impose itself on Lebanon. The Lebanese government is very weak and unable to cope itself. So this underlines a problem that we should have realized from our experiences with Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Russians should have realized now with their experiences in Ukraine, where you're not welcome, and when you've got militias which are strongly popularly based, it's very difficult to defeat them. And again, it's not clear what the political solutions to these problems are. To some extent, they depend on what's going to happen in Iran, because the odd thing about all of this is Iran itself is in a pretty fragile state. So things could change within Iran more than one might expect them to change, say, in Beijing or Moscow. But it's part and parcel of what we've got. And it's one of the factors that influences the way that Gaza's handled, to the extent that a lot of Arab countries, who are undoubtedly very cross and irritated with Israel, nonetheless are also very worried about what this means for them if Iran is calling the shots throughout the Middle East, which is one reason why they joined in implicitly or explicitly in blocking the Iranian missile strikes against Israel. So, and this is, as long as, part of the world I followed for a long time, and it's never been properly stable. And the problem with the Middle East is every time you move to solve one problem, you just find you've aggravated another part of the problem somewhere else.
And it strikes me that Europe, at least, has relatively little influence over what goes on.
No, I mean, I think America and the other Arab countries, I mean, the EU is an important player, and the UK could be part of it because they funded an awful lot of Palestine. The frustrating thing for me, and there are many frustrating and upsetting things about Gaza, is the obvious solution, which of course never happens in the Middle East, which is that you take Gaza out of the hands of both Hamas and Israel, which I think was possible, and may still be possible, wasn't followed. If it is going to be followed, it's not going to come through the United Nations. It'll come through a conference geared to the reconstruction of Gaza, because there's no way Hamas, even if it got back control, could begin to start the reconstruction of Gaza, given what's happened. So if I wanted to take an initiative, it's not good enough just to say, well, we believe in two-state solution. Fine, everybody can sign up to that. But Palestine doesn't have the capacity to form its own state at the moment, but it's certainly an aspiration that you would want. The immediate challenge is to do something about the wretched state of Gaza, to get some sort of grip on what's been going on in the West Bank. And I think the only way to do that is the way that the Americans looked like they were trying to do it way back in 1991, who organized a conference, international conference, and not try to do it through mediation, which is just not going to work.
So, I mean, turning to the UK, there's an awful lot going on in the world. I suppose the first question is, to what extent does is the refreshed integrated review fit for purpose now? Has it aged well?
I don't think that, I would not advise Labour to have a refresh of the refresh. I don't think it's needed. I think it was a perfectly good document. The things that they grumbled a bit about, I think they're more reconciled to, like the UK is now, one way or the other, involved in quite a lot of areas in the Indo-Pacific. They're not going to abandon AUKUS. I mean, AUKUS will have problems, but they're not going to abandon it. So my view is they don't need another defence review. Well, I can see why they might have a defence review just as a way of getting around the 2.5% issue. Well, they've said when economic conditions allow. I mean, it's actually when international conditions allow that should determine that, I think. And international conditions are here and now. That'll be one of the issues at the NATO summit, for example. And to be frank, Lammy and Healy have done the hard yards. I mean, they've done quite a lot of work on the issues. They're not going to come in totally cold. And I think reviews are a way of putting off decisions that are going to come rushing in at them now. So I wouldn't urge them to have lots of reviews. I'd urge them to try and make some decisions on what needs to be done. And there's a lot of thinking that's required on the armed forces that partly comes from Ukraine, where thinking on drone warfare, which was there beforehand, has just been revolutionized by the fact that it's not big, expensive drones that have made the difference. It's pretty cheap, expendable drones that have made the difference. And the fact that Ukraine, actually with the UK very closely involved, has become a world leader in certain sorts of long-range drone technology. There's things that we can do there that challenge some of the assumptions upon which our defence forces have been based. And you've got the whole question of what you do with the army, which has been through a difficult time after Iraq and Afghanistan. So, I mean, you've got time, I think, to fix that, but you need to show that you're working. But I'm a skeptic when it comes to having big reviews. They're fine at calm periods in international affairs, but this isn't a calm period. And the fact is, oddly, that our next Prime Minister may be in one of the best political positions of any of the G7, which is not what we would have said a few years ago. So, but he hasn't, he's got no background in foreign affairs. When Blair came in, Jonathan Powell, as his chief of staff, it was a former diplomat. Sue Gray is very capable, but has got no background in foreign affairs. He'll soon find that's the main business of the Prime Minister. So he's got a very quick learning curve, I think.
I mean, it strikes me that another strength that Starmer has that is denied to many of his peers in the G7 is we have a broadly bipartisan consensus on most of the big political issues of the time. So would you expect anything significant? I mean, leave aside Europe, where there is real difference, but on other major foreign policy issues, is there anything you can see where you'd expect a shift or a change in direction under Labour?
Not particularly. That's another reason why I don't see a need for a big review. I mean, we have a bipartisan position on Ukraine. And, Lamy and Healy went to Kyiv not that long ago and sort of said reassuring things. I do think, I think there'll be a shift on Gaza. I mean, I think it'll be less, shall we say, understanding of the Israeli position, but I don't think it'll be, it's not going to shift too dramatically, but I think there will be a shift there. I don't think there'll be a big shift on Indo-Pacific. But it's not just that. One of the, for all the faults of the past government, and there have been many, on Ukraine they got it right, I think. And we're expecting to keep on pushing and taking the initiatives. It's going to be much harder for Starmer to do that straight off. I think he's not going to make himself very popular if he comes in 4 days after an election and starts telling everybody what to do. Nor do I think that's his style. So I think it's just a learning curve that's going to be interesting in finding his way around these issues.
I mean, it's interesting, actually, that both manifestos say virtually identical things about Gaza. The terminology is very, very similar.
Yeah, I think Cameron moved the government policy, and I mean, you'll have more talk about supporting a Palestinian state, and it's a way of sending messages to Israel that they've lost a lot of the argument in the way that they've handled themselves over the last however many months it is.
Now, even before they've become the government, Labour has got a new foreign policy doctrine, which David Lammy calls progressive realism. What did you make? What do you make of it?
Well, unfortunately, being progressive and being realistic doesn't always point in the same direction.
It's a win-win.
Win-win or lose-lose. I mean, some of us remember Robin Cook's ethical foreign policy, which is just inviting charges of hypocrisy. Yeah. Because you're going to have to deal, and the thing about foreign policy is you have to deal with foreigners. And they don't always have political systems comparable to your own or values comparable to your own. There was a very good line in the Integrated Review refresh pointing this out. And, Lammy's well aware of this. I mean, he veers more to the realistic than the progressive now. But it's a problem for Labour. So they can be progressive on things like climate change and so on. But, as was pointed out in the previous panel, you do need international action on that. And Sunak had been sort of distancing himself from past positions. But so are a lot of other countries. So that's not the basis of a progressive foreign policy all by itself, important though it is. So I think it's, and I think it goes back again to a theme of the previous panel, of being prepared to talk about trade-offs, being prepared to explain, and this is what seems to me what realists should always do, is that the choices are difficult, especially in foreign policy. Your power is far more limited than you think it is. You have to work with others, and some of the others you're going to have to work with are not always very nice people. The Churchill's famous line after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, if Hitler had invaded Hades will have a good word to say for the devil in the House of Commons. Sometimes you need to work with countries that are just a bit less bad than the people you're working against. And that needs to be accepted. You know, it's best if you can avoid it, but if you can't, you need to explain why and how.
I mean, this is an unfortunate rather than deliberate segue, but how concerned are you about a second Trump presidency?
Look, I mean, it's the polling tells you it's entirely possible. We'll see what happens when the two old men debate. I always find it desperately comforting that I'm still younger. I think the first, Trump didn't expect to become president last time, and everything was improvised. The people around him expect him to become president, and they're prepared. I think the biggest challenges, I think, are to the American democratic system and justice system, because I think that's frankly what interests Trump, what he'll care about more than anything else. China is going to be an issue. But you know, the thing about Trump is he's got no interest in having wars. Trump's interests are wholly transactional, and with China it's going to be about tariffs and so on, trade wars with Europe even, but not necessarily proper wars. And he's totally unpredictable in the end. We don't know, I mean, I think they're better prepared, but we still don't know fully what they plan. He's got a peace plan for Ukraine, which he'll sort it out in 24 hours. What happens if he doesn't is the interesting question. And I wouldn't be surprised if we end up more or less in the same position.
Okay, so you're not one of those who thinks that he'll undermine NATO on day one and go from there?
I think he's a potential challenge to NATO, and he doesn't like it. He said he understands why it's there. The deep state should never be underestimated in the US. It'll keep it there. The Europeans have got very little choice but to make NATO work as well as it can. But it's not going to be smooth. And you know, just the fact of having Trump as quotes unquote leader of the free world is a bit unnerving prospect all by itself.
All right, I think we'll take some questions from the audience. Actually, I'll get the iPad. I'll let you choose some. You just talk amongst yourselves while I get the iPad.
Sir Lawrence, my name's Paul Hudson. Thank you very much for your observations and analyses. I'd like to ask you a question about Russia. Given the numbers of members of the Russian armed forces that have reported to have been, or estimated to have been, killed or injured, and if that continues with the war in the Ukraine, if, say, President Putin, I know he's incredibly fit by all accounts, in the 70s, say died within the next 2 years, do you think that would lead to a significant change in Russian policy towards Ukraine and perhaps towards Western Europe?
So, I mean, there's lots of potential answers to that, so I'll be quick. First, I don't trust casualty figures, anybody's casualty figures in war, but a lot of Russians have died, no doubt. A lot of Ukrainians have died. A lot of the soldiers who've died in Ukraine have not been from Moscow and St. Petersburg. They've been ethnic minorities from other regions. So it's not hitting home in the ways that one might expect. And there's sort of stoicism in Russia that one shouldn't underestimate until it ends. So they're capable of having mutinies, but they haven't really happened yet. Secondly, I think the economic pressures are manageable. As a number of people have pointed out, Russia has got far better macroeconomists than they do generals. And that has kept the economy going quite remarkably. But the strains are there with inflation, interest rates, and labour shortages, which are not obviously unconnected with the number of people who've been sent to war. The labour shortages are getting quite intense. Third, I think people many in Russia are very unhappy with their dependence on China. I mean, this is an extraordinary geopolitical shift that's taking place. Russia has cut off its European options and is by far the junior partner. You can see in every communique that Putin and Xi sign. It must really be embarrassing for Putin because he just keeps on agreeing to every of Xi's latest strategy for human civilization, or whatever he calls them. China is just taking advantage of Russia at the moment, and a lot of Russians know that. But that's a consequence of the war. So would you Russians like to get out of this war? I'm sure. Can they do it while Putin's there? Very difficult. Putin, 2 years ago, there were all sorts of stories about Putin's health. A lot of it was wishful thinking, I guess. But I think if Putin went, I think there would be a shift in Russian policy. The hardest thing is to work out the circumstances in which Putin manages to accept that the war isn't going anywhere. And I think we're some way from that. So I think it's a build-up of pressure in Moscow. We got caught by surprise by the Prigozhin mutiny. So strange things happen, and we don't have enough knowledge of what's going on in the Kremlin. So the prudent course is to assume it lasts, but it may not, because we don't quite know what's going on.
Yes, Stephen Evans, Durham University, former NATO official. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about deterrence. Deterrence as an art and a science played out pretty well during the Cold War, but the world has changed. We now have to worry about Russia, we have to worry about China, we have to worry about other threats, cyber threats, informal threats, terrorist threats. How is deterrence going to evolve? What is deterrence for the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, deterrence worked really well during the Cold War. The great thing about deterrence is it sounds just right. It's not, you're defending, it's not going on the offensive, but it's robust at the same time. So you're not inviting war, you're telling people not to fight it, and you're being very robust about your interests. But the danger is, I think, we think that everything can be deterred. And when something happens that we don't like, we say, well, that's a failure in deterrence. It isn't, just some things happen that are very hard to get into the mind of an adversary about the things that you will do as a response. My preference is to accept that some things can be deterred, the big things, but not everything. There's also, those of you who are sort of seeped in the theology of deterrence will be aware of the distinction between deterrence by denial and by punishment. So basically, deterrence involves making sure that in the adversary's perception, potential costs exceed potential gains. And you can impose costs, which is punishment, or you can prevent gains, which is denial. And it's far, far better to deny. It really is the best way to do things. So that means looking to your defenses, making societies resilient, which is the way I think you deal with terrorism, which we have dealt with terrorism reasonably well. Don't assume that as soon as something bad happens, that there's going to be an obvious way of punishing the adversary. I think that's part of the problem Putin's got into. He's always talking about the terrible things that they will do. I mean, former President Medvedev, to the extent that he's sober, is the worst at this, who gives sort of long rants every time something unfortunate is going to happen to Russia. And people just laugh at him now. It loses credibility. So to be credible, it's best to think about what you can directly stop happening and save the threats of punishment for the really big things. And not pretend that everything unfortunate in the world you can stop by making threats, because it's very hard to do that, and things will happen that you just didn't expect. And I think, again, it goes part of the problem the Israelis have got into. They're always talking about restoring deterrence by beating up people who've harmed them. And it doesn't really work.
We've got time for one more if it is quick. Mirren, I'll let you choose. Delegate the decision making.
Thank you. Mehdi Scaria, Research Director at Harwell. Sir Lawrence, according to John Bolton, former National Security Advisor of the United States, Trump came very close of pulling out of NATO.
Yeah.
Let's say during his first year, 28th of February 2025, if he pulls out or he announces to pull out from NATO, what will happen? What will follow?
First, it's not easy for him to pull out. The Senate passed a resolution. I mean, this would require a large majority in the Senate, which you don't have, even if the Republicans take the Senate back. So it's actually quite difficult. I think my concern is much more the next big crisis, or even in connection with Ukraine. He's pulling back. He's making it clear he doesn't want to take any risks on behalf of the United States. I think that's a bigger question. He keeps on this campaign, which in some ways is fair enough, to get the Europeans to do more and pay more. And they'll say they will. And they already are doing a bit more than they did. And Putin, and a combination of Putin and Trump helped with that push. The problem for the Europeans, and certainly a problem for the UK, is they don't really have an option other than to work with the US. They're just too integrated with the United States. They don't have capabilities that only the Americans can provide. So I think what you'll get from Europeans, if Trump is, whatever he says he's going to do, is a bit more hedging, a bit more trying to work together. But basically, they're going to try and see it through and hope that actually he does leave at the end of the next 4 years. And it'll be very difficult. But I don't think they're too tied in. You can't have an alliance that's lasted 75 years and suddenly unravel it. And Trump will find that too. I mean, the American military would be at a bit of a loss if that happened as well. So I think it's going to be tense and difficult, but I don't think I hope not unmanageable.
Laurie, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We had the room till 5 o'clock, but thank you ever so much for agreeing to do that. And just before we finish, thank you to all of you. This is the last big event we've got programmed for a while, but look out on our newsletter for future events. And I wanted you all to put your hands together to Mirren, who arranged everything today and has left. That's great. Thanks to all of you so much. Thanks to all the panelists, to all the speakers, and to all of you for coming. All the best. Have a good evening.